The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty trail as Samuel McKinnon rode his horse slowly through the canyon. His weathered hands gripped the reins loosely, his mind elsewhere as it had been for the past 6 months. The gold wedding band on his finger caught the light, a painful reminder of what he had lost. Sarah had been gone half a year now, taken by the fever that swept through their small town like wildfire. The ranch felt empty without her laughter echoing through the rooms. Without her gentle voice calling him in for supper, Samuel had taken to riding the backcountry trails more often lately. Seeking solace in the vast wilderness that stretched endlessly around their homestead, the loneliness ate him like a slow poison, making every sunrise feel like a burden rather than a blessing. He was 42 years old, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt truly alone in the world. The sound reached him before he saw anything unusual. It was faint at first, barely audible over the clip-clop of his horse's hooves on the rocky ground. Then it came again, clearer this time. A woman's voice, weak and desperate, calling for help. Samuel pulled his horse to a stop and listened carefully. The voice seemed to be coming from somewhere up ahead, beyond a cluster of large boulders that blocked his view of the trail. He urged his horse forward, his senses suddenly alert. As he rounded the rocks, the scene that greeted him made his blood run cold. 3 covered wagons sat scattered across a small clearing, their canvas tops torn and riddled with bullet holes. Bodies lay motionless on the ground, and the smell of gunpowder still hung heavy in the air. This had been a massacre. It couldn't have happened more than a few hours ago. Samuel dismounted quickly, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver at his hip. His eyes scanned the area for any sign of movement, any indication that the attackers might still be nearby. The silence was deafening, broken only by the gentle whisper of wind through the canyon walls, and that faint voice still calling for help. He followed the sound toward the turned wagon at the far edge of the clearing. As he drew closer, he could see a slender hand reaching out from beneath the heavy wooden debris. Samuel hurried forward and began carefully moving the broken planks and torn canvas away. Underneath he found a young woman, her face pale and streaked with dirt and tears. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, with auburn hair that had come loose from its pins and now fell in tangled waves around her shoulders. Her dress, though torn and stained, looked to be made of fine material, much finer than what most frontier women wore. But what struck Samuel most were her eyes, a deep green that seemed to hold both fear and determination in equal measure. The woman tried to sit up as he freed her from the debris, wincing in pain as she moved. Samuel could see that her left arm was injured, probably broken, and there were cuts and bruises visible on her face and hands. Despite her obvious pain, she looked up at him with gratitude that nearly took his breath away. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from calling for help. "I thought no one would come. I thought I was going to die here." Samuel knelt beside her, his natural instinct to help overriding the caution that frontier life had taught him. "Easy now, miss. You're safe. Let me take a look at that arm." She allowed him to examine her injuries, though she kept glancing around nervously at the bodies scattered throughout the clearing. "The others," she said quietly. "Are any of them alive?" Samuel had already checked while searching for survivors. He shook his head gently. "I'm sorry. You're the only one who made it." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but she quickly wiped them away with her good hand. Samuel could see that despite her obvious grief and pain, this was a woman with considerable strength and courage. She wasn't falling apart, even though she had every right to do so. "What happened here?" Samuel asked as he fashioned a makeshift sling for her injured arm, using a strip of cloth torn from her petticoat. The woman's jaw tightened with anger. "Raiders. They came at us just after dawn, whooping and shooting. We had 3 men with guns, but there were too many attackers. They took everything of value and left us for dead." She paused, her voice breaking slightly. "My Uncle Thomas was leading this expedition. He was such a good man. He didn't deserve to die like this." Samuel helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as she swayed unsteadily. "We need to get you to town. Get that arm properly set by the doctor. Can you ride?" She nodded, though he could see the effort it took for her to remain upright. "I think so. But what about them?" She gestured toward the bodies of her fallen companions. "I'll come back with help from town." "We'll see that they get a proper burial," Samuel promised. The woman seemed relieved by his words, and he could see some of the tension leave her shoulders as Samuel helped her toward his horse. She suddenly stopped and looked back at the wreckage of the wagons. "There's something I need to retrieve. It survived the attack." Samuel watched as she carefully made her way to one of the overturned wagons and began searching through the scattered contents. After a few minutes, she pulled out a small leather pouch that had been hidden beneath some clothing. She clutched it tightly to her chest with her good hand, and Samuel couldn't help but notice the relief that washed over her face. "Family heirloom?" he asked gently. She hesitated for just a moment before nodding. "Something like that. It's all I have left now." Samuel didn't press her for details. Everyone on the frontier had their secrets, their private sorrows, and hidden treasures. He helped her mount his horse, then climbed up behind her to steady her during the ride to town. As they left the scene of the massacre behind, Samuel found himself wondering about this mysterious woman who had survived when everyone else had perished. There was something about her that intrigued him, something that made him feel more alive than he had in months. The ride to Millbrook took nearly 3 hours, with Samuel keeping his horse at a steady but gentle pace to avoid jarring his injured passenger. The woman, who had introduced herself simply as Catherine, remained mostly silent during the journey, though Samuel could feel the tension in her body as she leaned against him for support. Every so often, she would glance back toward the canyon where her traveling companions lay dead, her green eyes filled with a mixture of grief and something else. Samuel couldn't quite identify it as they approached the outskirts of town. Catherine suddenly straightened in the saddle. "Mr. McKinnon, I need to ask you something important." She had learned his name during their quiet conversation on the trail. "Would it be possible for me to stay somewhere private while I recover? I don't want word of the attack spreading too quickly. There might be people who would take advantage of a woman traveling alone." Samuel understood her concern. The frontier could be a dangerous place for anyone, but especially for a woman without protection. Doc Henderson lives above his practice. His wife Martha keeps a spare room for patients who need extended care. They're good people, and they know how to keep their mouths shut when necessary. Catherine nodded gratefully. "Thank you. I realize I'm asking a great deal from a stranger, but I have nowhere else to turn." Something in her voice made Samuel glance back at her. There was a vulnerability there that she was trying hard to hide, but also a dignity that suggested she wasn't accustomed to asking for help from anyone. He found himself wondering about her background, about the life she had lived before this terrible day changed everything. The town of Millbrook was typical of many frontier settlements, with a single main street lined with wooden buildings housing the essential businesses every community needed. The general store, the saloon, the blacksmith shop, and Doc Henderson's medical practice were all clustered together in the center of town. Samuel guided his horse directly to the doctor's office. Dismounting quickly to help Catherine down, Doc Henderson was an elderly man with kind eyes and gentle hands that had delivered babies and patched up gunshot wounds with equal skill for over 20 years. He took one look at Catherine's injured arm and immediately ushered them inside, calling for his wife to prepare the spare room upstairs while the doctor examined Catherine's injuries. Samuel waited in the front room, pacing restlessly. He couldn't shake the image of her green eyes looking up at him with such gratitude. When he had pulled her from beneath that wreckage, there had been something in that moment, a connection he hadn't felt since Sarah's death, that both frightened and intrigued him. Martha Henderson, a plump woman with graying hair and a motherly demeanor, appeared at his elbow. "She's going to be fine," she said quietly. "The arm is broken, but it's a clean break. Doc says it should heal properly with rest. The cuts and bruises will fade in time." Samuel nodded, relieved. "Mrs. Henderson, Catherine asked if she could stay here quietly while she recovers. She's concerned about word of the attack getting out." Martha's expression grew serious. "Of course. We've sheltered women in difficult circumstances before. She'll be safe here." She paused, studying Samuel's face. "What about you? You look like you could use some rest yourself. This kind of thing takes a toll on everyone involved." Samuel realized he was more shaken by the day's events than he had initially thought. Finding that massacre, pulling Catherine from the wreckage, seeing the fear and pain in her eyes, it had awakened emotions in him that had been dormant since Sarah's death. "I'm fine, Mrs. Henderson. But I need to ride back out with Sheriff Walsh and some men to deal with the bodies." The sheriff, a burly man named Jake Walsh, was immediately interested when Samuel reported the massacre. Within an hour, they had assembled a group of 6 men to return to the canyon. Samuel led them back to the scene, his stomach churning as they approached the site where he had found Catherine. The bodies were still there, already beginning to attract buzzards in the afternoon heat. Samuel watched as the men went about the grim business of identifying the dead and gathering their personal effects. Among the victims, they found an older man who appeared to be in his 60s, well-dressed and carrying papers that identified him as Thomas Whitmore of Philadelphia. "Whitmore," Sheriff Walsh muttered, examining the documents. "That name sounds familiar. Seems like I've seen it in the territorial newspapers." Samuel helped load the bodies onto a makeshift wagon they had brought for that purpose. As they worked, he couldn't stop thinking about Catherine alone in that wreckage. How frightened she must have been. How she had managed to survive when everyone else had died. The thought of losing her, this woman he barely knew, filled him with an unexpected sense of dread. By the time they returned to town, word of the attack had begun to spread despite their attempts at discretion. Samuel could see curious faces peering from windows and doorways as they made their way to the undertaker's establishment. He knew it would only be a matter of time before everyone in Millbrook knew about the massacre, and about the mysterious woman who had survived it. That evening, Samuel found himself back at Doc Henderson's office, ostensibly to check on Catherine's condition, but really because he couldn't seem to stay away. Martha let him sit with her for a few minutes, and he was relieved to see that some color had returned to her cheeks. Catherine was awake. Propped up against several pillows, her injured arms securely splinted and supported in a sling. She looked smaller somehow in the large bed, more fragile than she had appeared at the massacre site. But her eyes were alert, and she managed a weak smile when she saw him. "Mr. McKinnon, I can't thank you enough for everything you've done today. You saved my life." Samuel felt heat rise in his cheeks at her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same, miss. I'm just glad I happened to be riding that trail when I was." She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read something there. "Martha tells me you lost your wife recently. I'm very sorry for your loss." The mention of Sarah hit him like a physical blow, as it always did. But somehow, hearing it from Catherine didn't bring the usual crushing wave of grief. Instead, he felt something else, something that might have been the beginning of healing. "6 months ago," he said quietly, "fever took her quick. We'd been married 18 years. Catherine reached out with her good hand and briefly touched his fingers. The contact was brief but electric, sending warmth shooting up his arm. She was lucky to have someone who loved her so deeply. Not everyone gets that kind of love in their lifetime. As Samuel rode home to his empty ranch house that night, Catherine's words echoed in his mind. For the first time since Sarah's death, he began to wonder if perhaps his story wasn't over after all. Over the following weeks, Samuel found himself visiting Catherine at the Hendersons' medical practice with increasing frequency. What began as simple courtesy calls to check on her recovery gradually evolved into something more meaningful for both of them. Catherine proved to be intelligent and well-educated, with a sharp wit that often caught Samuel off guard and made him laugh in ways he hadn't since Sarah's death. During their conversations, Samuel learned that Catherine was originally from Philadelphia, where she had lived with her Uncle Thomas after being orphaned at a young age. She spoke fondly of her uncle, describing him as a kind man who had given her opportunities that many women never received. She had been educated at a private school and had even spent a year studying art in Boston, experiences that seemed almost exotic to Samuel, who had never traveled farther east than Denver. What Catherine didn't reveal was the true extent of her uncle's wealth and influence. Thomas Whitmore had been one of Philadelphia's most successful shipping magnates, with business interests that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific territories. The leather pouch she had clutched so desperately at the massacre site contained more than family mementos. It held documents that would make her one of the wealthiest women in the territory. if not the entire western frontier, Catherine had her reasons for keeping this information secret. She had seen firsthand how money changed people, how it made them calculating and false. In Millbrook, she was simply a woman recovering from a tragedy. People treated her with genuine kindness rather than the calculated interest she had grown accustomed to in Philadelphia society. For the first time in her adult life, she felt truly free to be herself. Samuel, meanwhile, was discovering that his heart wasn't as permanently closed as he had believed. Catherine's presence brought light back into his world in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. She had a way of listening that made him feel truly heard, and her gentle questions about his life and his ranch made him remember why he had once loved farming the land. When she asked about Sarah, found he could speak of his late wife without the crushing pain that had plagued him for months. One afternoon, as Catherine's arm continued to heal, Samuel arrived at the Hendersons to find her sitting on the front porch, sketching the Main Street scene with her good hand. She had found some paper and charcoal, and Samuel was amazed by the skill evident in her drawing. She had captured not just the buildings and the people, but somehow the very essence of frontier life. "That's remarkable," Samuel said, settling into the chair beside her. "You've got real talent." Catherine blushed at the compliment. "It's just something I've always enjoyed. Uncle Thomas encouraged my artistic pursuits, though he never quite understood why I preferred sketching real life to painting formal portraits." She paused in her work and looked at Samuel directly. "Would you mind if I sketched you sometime? You have such an interesting face, so much character in it." Samuel felt his cheeks warm at her request. No woman had ever asked to draw him before, and the idea both flattered and embarrassed him. "I'm not much to look at, miss. Just a simple rancher." "That's exactly why I'd like to draw you," Catherine replied. "You're real, Samuel. You're honest and kind and strong. Those are beautiful qualities that deserve to be captured." The way she said his name, with such warmth and sincerity, made something shift inside Samuel's chest. He found himself agreeing to pose for her, though he wondered what Sarah would have thought about another woman wanting to capture his likeness. As if reading his thoughts, Catherine spoke softly. "Your wife wouldn't mind, you know. From everything you've told me about her, she sounds like she was a generous, loving woman. She would want you to be happy." Samuel looked at Catherine with surprise. It was as if she had seen directly into his heart and understood the guilt he felt about beginning to care for another woman. "How can you be so sure?" "Because that's what love is," Catherine said simply. "Real love wants what's best for the person, even if that means letting them go. Even if that means wanting them to find happiness again." That evening, Samuel rode home with Catherine's words echoing in his mind. As he sat on his front porch, looking out over the land that he and Sarah had worked together to build into a thriving ranch, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: peace. For the first time since Sarah's death, he could think about the future without feeling like he was betraying her memory. The next morning brought unexpected visitors to Millbrook in the form of 3 well-dressed men on expensive horses. They rode directly to the sheriff's office, and within an hour, word spread through town that they were asking questions about the Wagon train massacre and specifically about any survivors. Martha Henderson hurried to warn Catherine, who went pale at the news. "They've found me," she whispered, clutching the leather pouch she now kept always within reach. "Who are they?" Martha asked, concerned by Catherine's obvious distress. Catherine hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "They're probably lawyers or businessmen from Philadelphia. When word gets out about Uncle Thomas's death, there will be many people interested in his estate." She didn't mention that she was now the sole heir to that considerable fortune, or that these men might not have her best interests at heart. Samuel arrived. Just as the 3 strangers were preparing to visit the doctor's office, he could see from their expensive clothes and calculating expressions that these weren't men to be trusted lightly. When they introduced themselves as representatives of the Whitmore business interests, Samuel felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "We understand there was a survivor of the attack on Thomas Whitmore's expedition," the lead man, who identified himself as Mr. Harrison, said smoothly. "We're here to assist her in any way possible, and to help her return to Philadelphia where she belongs." Samuel Didn't like the man's tone or the way his eyes glittered with what looked like greed rather than genuine concern. Miss Catherine is still recovering from serious injuries. She's not ready for any kind of travel. Harrison's smile was thin and humorless. Of course, we understand her condition must be delicate. However, there are urgent business matters that require her immediate attention. Mr. Whitmore's estate is quite complex, and there are decisions that only his heir can make. The word heir hung in the air like a challenge. Samuel saw Catherine's face go even paler, and he realized that there were things about her situation that she hadn't shared with him. Whatever secrets she was keeping, it was clear that these men represented a threat to the peaceful life she had begun to build in Millbrook. The lady will make her own decisions about her future, Samuel said firmly, stepping slightly in front of Catherine in a protective gesture. When she's ready. Harrison's eyes narrowed as he studied Samuel, clearly recognizing him as an obstacle to their plans. And you are? A friend, Samuel replied simply, but his hand rested casually on the butt of his revolver. A good friend who intends to make sure Catherine isn't pressured into anything while she's still recovering from her ordeal. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Catherine stood quietly behind Samuel, her heart pounding as she realized that her carefully guarded secret was about to be exposed. The peaceful interlude in Millbrook was coming to an end, and she wasn't sure she was ready for the battle that lay ahead. That evening, Catherine asked Samuel to walk with her to the small creek that ran behind the town. Her arm was healing well, and Doc Henderson had said she could begin light activities as long as she didn't strain herself. As they strolled along, the water's edge in the fading twilight, Catherine knew she could no longer keep her secret from the man who had become so important to her. Samuel, there are things about me that you don't know, she began, her voice trembling slightly with nervousness. Things that might change how you feel about me. Samuel stopped walking and turned to face her fully. Catherine, nothing you could tell me would change the fact that you're a good woman who survived something terrible, and has shown more courage and grace than anyone has a right to expect. His unwavering faith in her only made what she had to say more difficult. Catherine took a deep breath and pulled the leather pouch from her dress pocket. Uncle Thomas wasn't just a merchant, Samuel. He was one of the wealthiest men in Philadelphia. His shipping company controlled trade routes from New York to San Francisco, and he had investments in railroads, mining operations, and real estate across the country. Samuel's expression remained neutral, though she could see him processing this information. Go on. When he died in that attack, I became his sole heir. This pouch contains the legal documents that prove it, along with bank drafts worth more money than most people see in a lifetime. Catherine's voice broke slightly. Samuel, I'm rich. Very rich. Those men who came to town today, they're not here to help me. They're here because they want to control my uncle's business empire, and they think a grieving woman will be easy to manipulate. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the creek as it bubbled over the smooth stones. Catherine held her breath, waiting for his reaction, fearing that this revelation would drive him away, just as her feelings for him were deepening into something she had never experienced before. Does it make you happy? He asked finally. The question surprised her. What? The money? Does it make you happy? Catherine considered his question seriously. No, it never has. In Philadelphia, I was surrounded by people who only saw dollar signs when they looked at me. Every social invitation, every suitor, every friendship was tainted by what I represented rather than who I was as a person. The money was a barrier between me and genuine human connection. Samuel nodded slowly. Then why are you telling me this? Because I care about you too much to lie to you, Catherine said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. And because those men aren't going to give up easily. They'll try to force me to return to Philadelphia, and if they can't do it legally, they might try other methods. Don't want you caught up in something dangerous because of me. Samuel turned back to her, and the expression in his eyes made her heart skip a beat. Instead of the rejection or calculation she had feared, she saw only the same warmth and caring that had drawn her to him from the beginning. Catherine, I fell in love with a brave woman who survived a massacre and showed more strength in one day than most people show in a lifetime. I fell in love with someone who sketches pictures of ordinary life because she finds beauty in simple things. I fell in love with a woman who listens when I talk about my wife without jealousy, and who helped me remember that my heart wasn't buried in Sarah's grave. Samuel reached out and gently touched her face. Your money doesn't change any of that. The words hung in the air between them like a sacred promise. Catherine felt her tears spill over as she realized that Samuel had just declared his love for her, and that her wealth truly didn't matter to him. For the first time in her adult life, she was being loved for exactly who she was, rather than what she possessed. I love you too, she whispered, allowing him to pull her into his arms. The kiss that followed was gentle and sweet, filled with all the emotion that had been building between them over the past weeks. When they finally broke apart, Samuel's expression grew serious. But you're right about those men being dangerous. Men like that don't give up easily when there's that kind of money involved. We need to be smart about this. Catherine nodded, grateful that he was thinking clearly even in this emotional moment. They'll probably try to convince me that I need their protection and guidance to manage Uncle Thomas's affairs. They might even have legal documents that appear to give them authority over the estate. Then we need to make sure you have legal representation of your own, Samuel said. Someone who works for you, not for them. The next morning, Samuel rode to the county seat in Cedar Falls to consult with Judge Harrison Blackwood, a man known throughout the territory for his honesty and legal expertise. Samuel had dealt with Judge Blackwood several years earlier during a land dispute and had been impressed by the man's integrity and sharp mind. Judge Blackwood listened carefully as Samuel explained Catherine's situation, his weathered face growing increasingly grim as he learned about the Philadelphia men's arrival in Millbrook. I've seen this kind of thing before, the judge said when Samuel finished. Wealthy men die unexpectedly, and suddenly everyone with a legal degree comes crawling out of the woodwork claiming to represent the deceased's interests. Most of the time, they're really representing their own interests. What can Catherine do to protect herself? Samuel asked. Judge Blackwood leaned back in his chair, considering the question. First, she needs to establish her legal identity and her right to her uncle's estate through the territorial courts. That will create an official record that can't be disputed or manipulated. Second, she needs to hire her own legal counsel, someone with no ties to Philadelphia or her uncle's business associates. Would you be willing to represent her? Samuel asked hopefully. The judge smiled. Mr. McKinnon, I thought you'd never ask. I've been practicing law for 30 years, and I've never backed down from a fight when I believed right was on my side. If this young woman is truly Thomas Whitmore's heir, and if these men are trying to manipulate her for their own gain, then I'd be honored to stand with her. Samuel felt a surge of relief and gratitude. Catherine would have a fighting chance against whatever schemes the Philadelphia lawyers had in mind. When Samuel returned to Millbrook that afternoon, he found the town in an uproar. The three men from Philadelphia had spent the morning spreading word that Catherine was mentally unstable due to her ordeal and needed to be returned to proper medical care in the East. They had also suggested that anyone who interfered with their efforts to help her might face legal consequences. Samuel went directly to the Hendersons' office, where he found Catherine pale but determined. They're trying to turn the town against you, she told him. They're claiming that you're taking advantage of my vulnerable state and that I'm not mentally competent to make my own decisions. Samuel felt anger surge through him at the underhanded tactics, but he forced himself to remain calm. Judge Blackwood has agreed to represent you. We're going to fight this the right way. Through the legal system, Catherine's face brightened with the first hope she had felt all day. Do you really think we can win? Samuel took her hands in his, looking directly into her green eyes. Catherine, I've learned something about you over these past weeks. You're the strongest person I've ever met. The right legal help and the truth on our side, those men don't stand a chance. As the sun set over Millbrook that evening, Samuel and Catherine stood together on the Hendersons' front porch. Knowing that the battle for her freedom and her future was just beginning, but they also knew they weren't facing it alone. Judge Blackwood arrived in Millbrook 3 days later, bringing with him a stern demeanor and a leather satchel full of legal documents. The Philadelphia men had not expected Catherine to secure independent legal representation so quickly, and Samuel could see their confidence waver when they learned of the judge's reputation and involvement in the case. The confrontation took place in the town's small courthouse, a building that rarely saw such dramatic proceedings. Catherine sat beside Judge Blackwood at the plaintiff's table, her injured arm still in a sling, but her spine straight with determination. Samuel sat directly behind her, offering silent support and occasionally catching her eye to give her an encouraging nod. The lead Philadelphia attorney, Mr. Harrison, had brought documents claiming that Thomas Whitmore had appointed his business partners as executors of his estate with full authority to make decisions on behalf of any heirs. He argued that Catherine was too traumatized by her recent ordeal to make rational decisions about complex financial matters. Judge Blackwood listened patiently to Harrison's arguments. Before rising to address the court, "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying the authority of decades in the courtroom. "What we have here is a classic case of opportunistic lawyers attempting to take advantage of a grieving woman for financial gain." He opened Catherine's leather pouch and carefully laid out the documents it contained. "Miss Catherine Whitmore possesses the original will of Thomas Whitmore, properly witnessed and notarized, which clearly names her as his sole heir. She also possesses bank drafts and property deeds that were specifically prepared for her inheritance. These documents predate the papers presented by the opposing counsel by several months." The judge hearing the case, a local magistrate named William Crawford, examined both sets of documents carefully. Samuel watched Catherine's face as the legal proceedings continued, admiring her composure under such pressure. She answered every question put to her with clarity and intelligence, effectively demonstrating that she was perfectly capable of making her own decisions. The turning point came when Judge Blackwood called Sheriff Walsh to testify about the condition in which Catherine had been found after the massacre. Walsh's detailed account of her courage and clear thinking in the aftermath of the attack undermined Harrison's claims about her mental state. "Sheriff," Judge Blackwood asked, "in your professional opinion, did Miss Whitmore display any signs of mental instability or impaired judgment during your investigation?" "None whatsoever," Walsh replied firmly. "In fact, she was the most helpful witness I've ever dealt with in a case like this. She remembered details about the attackers that will be crucial if we ever catch them. Her mind was sharp as a tack." Harrison tried to argue that the trauma might have delayed effects, but his case was rapidly falling apart. When Judge Crawford asked Catherine directly if she wished to return to Philadelphia with the men claiming to represent her interests, her answer was clear and decisive. "No, Your Honor. I have no desire to return to Philadelphia at this time. I am perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. I have chosen Judge Blackwood to represent my legal interests going forward." The magistrate's ruling was swift and definitive. Catherine was declared mentally competent and legally entitled to make her own decisions regarding her inheritance. The Philadelphia men were ordered to cease their interference and return any documents they had obtained related to the Whitmore estate. As they filed out of the courthouse, Harrison made one last attempt to pressure Catherine. "Miss Whitmore, you're making a serious mistake. Managing an estate of this magnitude requires expertise and connections that simply don't exist in this backwater territory. You'll lose everything within a year." Samuel stepped forward, placing himself between Harrison and Catherine. "The lady has made her decision. I suggest you respect it and leave town before people start asking uncomfortable questions about your methods." Harrison's eyes flashed with anger, but he seemed to recognize that he had lost this battle. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "There are other ways to handle situations like this." After the men left town, Catherine felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had won the legal battle, but Harrison's parting words suggested that other challenges might be coming. That evening, she and Samuel walked to their favorite spot by the creek to discuss what the victory meant for their future. "I'm free to make my own choices now," Catherine said, "but I'm not sure what those choices should be. I could return to Philadelphia and take over Uncle Thomas's business empire. Or I could liquidate everything and live a simpler life. For the first time, the decision is entirely mine." Samuel had been thinking about this moment since Catherine had first revealed her true circumstances. "What does your heart tell you to do?" Catherine turned to face him, her green eyes reflecting the starlight. "My heart tells me that I've never been happier than I have been these past few weeks in Millbrook. My heart tells me that I love you and want to build a life with you, if you'll have me." Samuel felt his breath catch at her words. "Catherine, are you sure? You could have anything, go anywhere, marry anyone. Why would you want to tie yourself to a simple rancher in a small frontier town?" "Because you see me, Samuel. Not my money, not my social position, not what I could do for you. You see me, and you love me for who I am. That's worth more than all of Uncle Thomas's shipping companies combined." Samuel pulled her into his arms, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. "Then marry me, Catherine. Not because you need protection or because I want your money, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it." Catherine's answer was a kiss that conveyed everything words couldn't express. When they finally parted, she whispered against his lips, "Yes, Samuel. Yes, to all of it." They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the Millbrook Church. With Doc and Martha Henderson serving as witnesses, Catherine wore a simple blue dress that Martha had helped her purchase from the general store, and Samuel wore his best Sunday suit. Judge Blackwood performed the ceremony. Having been ordained as a minister in his younger days, the entire town turned out for the wedding, and Samuel was touched by how completely the community had embraced Catherine as one of their own. She had used some of her resources to help several struggling families in town, but she had done it quietly, without fanfare, earning genuine affection rather than mere gratitude, as they exchanged vows. Samuel thought about Sarah and felt her blessing rather than her disapproval. Love wasn't a finite resource, and opening his heart to Catherine didn't diminish what he had shared with his first wife. It simply proved that the human heart was capable of healing and loving again. After the ceremony, there was a modest celebration at the church hall, with music provided by old Pete Morrison on his fiddle and dancing that lasted well into the evening. Samuel watched his new wife laugh and dance with the townspeople, and he knew that she had found her place in the world. Later that night, as they stood on the porch of Samuel's ranch house, their new home, Catherine pulled out the leather pouch that had started this whole adventure. "I've made some decisions about Uncle Thomas's estate," she said. "I'm going to keep enough to ensure our security and comfort, but the rest is going to be distributed among charities and educational institutions that Uncle Thomas supported. He believed in using wealth to help others, and I want to honor that." Samuel nodded approvingly. "What about the business interests?" "I'm selling them to competitors who will treat the employees fairly. I have no desire to run a shipping empire from a ranch in Colorado Territory." Catherine smiled and tucked the pouch away. "I'd rather raise cattle and children with the man I love." The mention of children made Samuel's heart skip a beat. The possibility of a family, of new life, and new beginnings filled him with a joy he hadn't dared to hope for just a few months ago as they stood together under the vast western sky. Samuel reflected on the strange turns that fate could take. A morning ride that had started as an attempt to escape his loneliness had led him to love again. A woman fleeing tragedy had found safety and happiness in his arms. Sometimes, he thought, the best things in life came from the most unexpected directions. 5 years had passed since that fateful morning when Samuel McKinnon had ridden out to escape his loneliness and instead found his future. The ranch had expanded considerably during that time, with Catherine's business acumen helping Samuel make strategic improvements that increased both their cattle herd and their profits. But more importantly, their home had filled with the sounds of family life that Samuel had never dared hope to hear again. Their 3-year-old daughter, Sarah Elizabeth, named for Samuel's first wife with Catherine's blessing, was chasing chickens in the yard while their infant son, Thomas Samuel, slept peacefully in Catherine's arms on the front porch. Catherine had insisted on naming their son after her uncle, wanting to honor the man whose death had ultimately led her to this new life. Samuel watched his wife and children from the corral where he was working with a young colt, and he still sometimes had to pinch himself to believe this was real. Catherine had adapted to ranch life with enthusiasm and grace, learning to ride expertly despite her initial inexperience with horses. She had also continued her artwork, and her paintings of frontier life had begun attracting attention from collectors as far away as Denver and San Francisco. The threat from the Philadelphia lawyers had never fully materialized. Though they had made a few more attempts over the years to challenge Catherine's control of her inheritance, each time Judge Blackwood had successfully defended her rights, and eventually the legal harassment had stopped. Catherine had made good on her promise to distribute most of Uncle Thomas's wealth to charitable causes, keeping enough to ensure their family's security and comfort, but not so. Much that wealth became the defining feature of their lives. Sheriff Walsh rode up to the ranch that afternoon, with news that made Samuel's blood run cold. "Sam, I've got word from the Territorial Marshal's office. They think they've finally tracked down the gang that hit that wagon train where you found Catherine. 3 of them were arrested in Wyoming Territory last week. They're talking about other jobs they pulled." Catherine had overheard from the porch and walked over to join them, still carrying baby Thomas. "Did they say anything about our attack specifically?" she asked. Walsh nodded grimly. "According to the marshal's report, it wasn't random. They were hired to hit that particular wagon train, specifically to kill Thomas Whitmore. Someone back east wanted him dead and was willing to pay handsomely for it." Samuel felt his jaw clench with anger. The idea that Catherine's uncle had been murdered, that she had nearly died as part of a calculated assassination, made him want to ride north and dispense his own justice. But he forced himself to remain calm for Catherine's sake. "Do they know who hired them?" Catherine asked, her voice steady, despite the shocking revelation. "They're still investigating. But the marshal thinks it might have been business rivals who wanted to take over Whitmore's shipping contracts. With him dead, and you presumably dead too, his company would have been vulnerable to a hostile takeover." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Then she looked up at Samuel with the same determined expression he had seen in her eyes that first day at the massacre site. "I want to testify at their trial," she said firmly. "Uncle Thomas deserves justice, and these men need to pay for what they did." The trial took place 6 months later in Denver, where the territorial courts had more experience handling complex criminal cases. Samuel accompanied Catherine and their children to the city, along with Judge Blackwood, who continued to serve as Catherine's legal counsel. The courthouse was packed with reporters and curiosity seekers, drawn by the sensational story of the wealthy heiress who had survived an assassination attempt. Catherine's testimony was powerful and moving. She spoke with clarity and dignity about her uncle's character, about the other innocent people who had died in the attack, and about her own struggle to survive in the aftermath. The defense attorneys tried to rattle her, but 5 years of frontier life had given Catherine a strength and confidence that made her unshakable on the witness stand. Samuel watched from the gallery, proud of his wife's courage and composure. Little Sarah sat quietly beside him, too young to fully understand the proceedings but sensing the importance of the occasion. Baby Thomas slept peacefully in Samuel's arms, oblivious to the drama unfolding around him. The 3 gunmen were convicted and sentenced to hang, but the mystery of who had hired them remained unsolved. The investigation had revealed evidence of a complex conspiracy involving several of Thomas Whitmore's business competitors. But proving their guilt beyond reasonable doubt had proven impossible. Catherine had to content herself with knowing that the actual killers would face justice, even if the masterminds remained free. After the trial, as they prepared to return to Millbrook, Catherine stood on the hotel balcony, overlooking Denver's bustling streets. Samuel joined her, wrapping his arms around her from behind as they watched the city come alive with evening activity. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Giving up the life you could have had for a simple existence on a Colorado ranch?" Catherine leaned back against him, feeling completely content in his embrace. "Samuel McKinnon, you rescued me from more than just that wagon wreckage. You rescued me from a life that was empty despite all its wealth and privilege. You gave me love, family, purpose, and a home where I truly belong." She turned in his arms to face him directly. "I was dying in Philadelphia just as surely as I was dying under that debris. The only difference is that the death would have been slower and less obvious. You didn't just save my life that day, you found me. You gave me a life worth living." Samuel kissed her forehead gently, marveling again at the unexpected turns that had brought them together. "Then we saved each other," he said, "because I was dying too, in my own way. dying of loneliness and grief until you showed me that hearts can heal and love again. They returned to their ranch the next day, to the wide-open spaces and honest work that had become their sanctuary. As their wagon topped the final hill and their home came into view, Catherine felt the same sense of peace and belonging that had first surprised her during those early days of recovery. Their neighbors had cared for the ranch during their absence, and everything was in perfect order. That evening, as they sat on their front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Catherine began sketching again. This time, she was drawing their family, capturing the moment of perfect contentment that she wanted to remember forever. Samuel watched her work, thinking about the strange paths that had led them to this moment. A grieving widower and a wealthy heiress seemed like an unlikely pair, but their love had grown from shared hardship, mutual respect, and the recognition of genuine character in each other. They had built something beautiful together, something that would last long after their own lives had ended, as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Samuel pulled Catherine closer to his side while their children slept peacefully inside their home. They had found their happy ending not in spite of the tragedy that had brought them together, but because of the strength and love they had discovered in each other during the darkest of times. Sometimes, Samuel reflected, the most beautiful stories began with the most painful chapters. But the ending made all the suffering worthwhile,